All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. So today's daf is daf Chaf Beis. We are picking up on Chaf Aleph on Beis 21b, and we are picking up in Mirza Hashem about 24 lines up from the bottom. The easiest way just to illustrate it is just right across from Tosos Mai. Right across from Tosos Mai there. So we'll say, so our share today is dedicated our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Adar Beis, Leah Sol, who dedicated all the shiurim and drushos this month in honor of all of those who helped with the beautiful groundbreaking. We thank Leah for her incredible generosity. With that, let us begin. So remember, we left off actually on a bit of a cliffhanger case, specifically the situation of Eishes Achi Ha'im Min Ha'im. What is the erva status of a one's mother's maternal brother's wife? What's the status of an erva in that situation? So the Gemara says, "My Tashma d'chi Asra Yehuda bar Shila Amar Rava." They said in Eretz Yisrael, "Kol shebenekeva erva bezachar gazru al ishto mishum shnia." So we'll say it's actually a very interesting model. In Eretz Yisrael, they said the following thing: any situation where the nekeva, a woman, is an erva, ultimately, again, in a corresponding case of a man, they were gozer on his wife. So because of shnia. So in other words, anytime you have a woman who's an erva, the corresponding man's wife ultimately will be a shnia le'erva as well. Is that true? That is a general rule. Chamoso erva. Well, let's look at this case. One's mother-in-law ultimately is an erva. Eishes chamav muteres. Yet, interestingly enough, the wife of one's father-in-law, who's obviously, again, not the mother of my wife, such a relationship is technically permitted. Similarly, bas chamoso erva, the daughter ultimately, again, of my father-in-law is an erva. Eishes ben chamoso muteres. Yet halacha l'maisa, the wife of the son of my father-in-law is mutter. So it would appear that the klal, the principle, does not hold true. Bas chamav erva. Ultimately, again, the daughter of one's mother-in-law is an erva. Eishes ben chamav muteres. Yet ultimately, again, the wife of the son of my father-in-law is mutter. Chogeres erva. Eishes chogarto muteres. So ultimately, again, chogeres also means again that the daughter of my wife is an erva. Eishes chogra muteres. Yet the wife of my wife's son is muter. Bas chograso. Ultimately, again, the daughter of my wife, erva. Eishes ben chogro muteres. Ultimately, again, the wife of the son of my wife is mutter. So the point over here the Gemara is saying is, it would appear that the rule doesn't always hold to be true. What does Rav Yehuda and Rav Yehuda bar Shila makes this rule? What does it come to include? Doesn't it come to include the wife, ultimately, again, of one's the wife of the mother's maternal brother? Ultimately, again, because, again, restating the rule that we had before, though the rule that we just challenged, anytime you have a situation of a woman who is an erva, the corresponding relationship by a man, ultimately his wife will be a shnia, will be a rabbinic erva. My shnahani or my shnahani. So I'll say, why is it that in one case the rule seems to be true, in the other case, in the other construct, or the grouping, seems not to be true? To which the Gemara says, ha bechad kiddushin mikrav la, ha ad diika trei kiddushin lo mikrav lu. We will say, because ultimately, again, in one set of relationships, the relationship is created through one kiddush. In other words, there's only one marriage away from affecting the relationship. In other words, it's a close relationship, versus the other group where halacha l'maisa, it's two marriages away. So the idea being over here, where it's two marriages away, the erva relationship is a bit more distant, and therefore halacha l'maisa, it's not a shnia, versus the case which is a close relationship will be a shnia. Good. Shalach le'ra misharshia mitusnaya l'rapapi. Yilamdina Rabbeinu. Rabbi teach us. Eishes achi avi ha'av. So we'll say, okay, so here we go. Eishes achi avi ha'av. So this is, again, literally my paternal grandfather's brother's wife. okay, my paternal grandfather's brother's wife, or va'achos avi ha'av, or for that matter, the sister of my paternal grandfather, mahu. Ultimately, what's the status of these women? Is this an erva? Is this an erva? So obviously, again, we're only talking about in the situation of a shnia, right? We're only talking about in the situation of rabbinic arayos. None of these cases are going to be da'araisas. But nevertheless, halacha l'maisa, that's the shaila. Mahu. Midilamata erva lamala nami gazrube. So do we say that the generations that come down from these relationships, and as Rabbi say, like in this family tree, like in the chart that I sent you yesterday, do we say that since everyone underneath these individuals ultimately is an erva, therefore again lamala nami gazrube, therefore again everyone above is also an erva? O Dilma ha ispalig darta, or maybe not look at Rashi, ispalig darta nisrachka korva. Maybe we say no. We'll say no. At a certain point in time, what we do have to say, what the Gemara suggests, maybe we do say is, people are just so far away in terms of the relationship that lamaisa there can't be a din of korva. There can't be a din of shnia. In other words, at a certain point in time, if a person is so far removed, halacha lamaisa it can't be a shnia. So that's the shaila. So tashma, here we go. Mahin shnios. Supposed to remember again, we saw before in the Braisa. The Braisa said, what is the case of shnios? V'lo kachashiv lehu bahadayu. And these cases are not included in the case of shnios. To which the Gemara say that would seem to indicate that they're not shnios. To which the Gemara says, Tana v'shir. In reality, the Tana went ahead and left certain things off. So halacha l'maisa again, the list of shnios is not an all-encompassing list. Some items were left off, to which the Gemara says, my shir da hai shir. So what else was left off? Shir shnios debei Rabbi Chia. We'll say ultimately again it left off the shnios of Rabbi Chia, which we're going to discuss in just a moment. Rabbi Chia has his own list of shnios, and our Braisa does not include that list. So the Gemara says as follows: Ameimar achsher be'eshes achi avi aviv uba'achos avi aviv. So ultimately, again, Ameimar said that halacha l'maisa, the wife of my paternal grandfather's brother. Right, so the wife of my paternal grandfather's brother, and ultimately again the sister of my grandfather. Ultimately, Ameimar said halacha l'maisa is not a shnia. Is not a shnia. Amar Filol Rav Ashi l'didi chazili shnios mar brei d'Ravna uksivan shisser l'isura. I saw myself ultimately the list of shnios according to Mar brei d'Ravna, and there were 16 cases of shnios. My love, Tamliya Demasnisa, is this 16 not made up of the following? 6 of the Braisa, V'shis debei Rabbi Chia, another 6 of Rabbi Chia, V'hanach Tarti, and these 2 last cases as well, to which the Gemara says, if you put that all together, Hashisar, Ulatamech, according to this logic, Shivsar Havyon, in reality it should be 17. Why? Because there's another case, Doha'ika, Eishes achi ha'em min ha'em. I will say, what about the following case? What about the wife of one's mother's maternal brother? The wife of one's let me say it differently. One's mother's maternal brother's wife. It's the easier way. Sometimes it's hard to figure out the right formulation. The wife of one's mother's maternal brother. The Pashtina Isura, that's a case of it. So we decided that's a case of Shnia. So shouldn't it be 17? To which the Gemara says, Halakasha. That last case is not a kasha. Why? Look at Rashi. I'm sorry. Top of Chav Beis, not yet. Top of Chav Beis. Hanach, Tarti Dedam Yala Hadad Kechad Chashavlu. Because we'll say those 2 cases, which are very similar to one another, ultimately again are counted as one case. Now we'll say, look at Rashi, top of Chav Beis. Rashi says, Eishes Achi Ha'av, Eishes Achi Avi Ha'av, the case of one's paternal grandfather's brother's wife, and the case of Achos Avi Ha'av, and the case ultimately again of my grandfather's sister. So those 2 cases are counted as one. Why, says Rashi? Shein sad achva da'av. Both of them ultimately again are sibling relationships that exist on the paternal side. Okay, so the Gemara is suggesting over here that we're somehow collapsing these cases, so therefore it's only Bahal Shissar. So ultimately again, and therefore we're left at 16. 16 cases, to which the Gemara says, Vaha, mikomakom lididi chazyon lan diksivan liisura. But I saw these cases before, the one that you said were mutar, and ultimately again, I saw that it was written down in the list of Ravna. Right, who was it? I'm sorry. It was in the Marbreid Ravna. And ultimately it was listed for Isser. And conversely, if it was written down leheter, ultimately again, would you halacha lamaisa have been samech on it? So the Gemara says, "Demar haviksiv leheter mi have samches alayu. Demar baravna mi chasem alayu." Ultimately, again, did Marbrei de Ravna ultimately sign on this? In other words, just because you saw it listed doesn't mean that ultimately all of the cases were decided. Hashtanami dichsiv li'isura lav Marbrei de Ravna chasim alayhu. So to over here, even though you see it recorded le'isr, it doesn't necessarily mean that Marbrei de Ravna conclusively decided that it was asr. Good. So we'll say, so again, so what you begin to see just is, as we go on, we begin to see that halacha l'maisa, we already saw in yesterday's daf, that the concept of shnios allows Chazal to extend the protective fence of erva through multiple generations. In other words, right, it's not just the pshat that a shnia means one extra person. Ultimately, again, we see the concept of shnios allows the isser of erva to extend out. Good. How far it extends out, who it applies to, that there's machlokas. So I'll say, let's begin. This is now another sugya. Still shnios, don't get worried, we're still here. Shlishi shebebno v'shebebito. This is an interesting case, Rabbi say. What about the following case? Shlishi shebebno. What about the case ultimately again of a, thank you much. Thank you very much. Yeah, you could. Thank you. I haven't made instant coffee in a while. It did not turn out well. Thank you. So the Gemara says as follows. No, you can leave it. It's like Zeicha L'Churban. It's good. So the Gemara says as follows. Shlishi shebibnov shebabito. So we'll say, here we go. What about the following case? Thank you very much. What about the following case? Look at Rashi. Shlishi shebibno. It's the second line in Rashi. Ben bas bino. Bas ben bino. So we'll say this is literally again the daughter of my grandson. The daughter of my grandson, which effectively makes us what? My great-granddaughter. Right, my great-granddaughter. So bas ben bino, daha bas bino erva. So we'll say a granddaughter is an erva. The shaila is a great-granddaughter an erva. So that's what it's called, shlishi shebibno v'shebebito. Rashi says, bas ben bito, or bas bito. Right? What about again a great-granddaughter on my daughter's side? So a great-granddaughter on my son's side, a great-granddaughter on my daughter's side. What's the halacha? So we'll say, so now what we're, again, this is the same question we're trying to figure out. Here's what we know. Chazal introduced to us the concept of shnios, the concept of additional layers of erva in order to protect biblical erva. We're just trying to figure out how far out does this construct go. So the Gemara says as follows, so Tanya Rabbi Chia, shlishi shebebno v'shebebito, ultimately again third generation, not from my son, great-granddaughter on my son's side, or great-granddaughter on my daughter's side, v'shebeben ishto, and ultimately again same thing on the son of my wife's side, v'shebebas ishto, or the daughter on my wife's side, shnia. Ultimately, you're about to say even third generation down is still covered under the rabbinic prohibition of shnia. So we'll say, so what this means is my great-granddaughter on my son's side, my great-granddaughter on my daughter's side, my great-grandchild ultimately, or my grandchild, I should say, on the son of my wife, the daughter of my wife, ultimately, again, all of these cases covered by shnia. Revi shebechama v'shebechamoso shnia. Similarly, again, the revi'i, the fourth kind of generation out on the side of my father-in-law and my mother-in-law, ultimately is going to be a shnia as well. Now, what's this case? Look at Rashi. Revi shebechamav, dor revi'i shebechamav. The fourth generation on my father-in-law's side. What's that case? Hainu aim chamav. V'hu revi'i le'ishto v'ishto bichlal. So Rabbi say, if you can imagine for a moment, the revi'i over here is the grandmother of my father-in-law, right? Or the grandmother of my mother-in-law. These are going to be cases, the Gemara calls this a fourth generation, because what it's looking at is as my wife as the first generation, my mother-in-law as the second generation, right? Her mother as the third generation, her grandmother as the fourth generation. So again, the Gemara says, this is still called a shnia, which is pretty incredible. So in other words, you begin to see, by the way, I don't know if in halacha, if anywhere else in halacha, you have such an enormous buffer, right? Because in general, again, Chazal go ahead and legislate their laws all of the time to create a protective fence around Torah. But here, you really begin to see how far out this concept of shnios goes. We're talking about grandmothers of in-laws, right? That's how far this extends out, which I will say kind of goes back to the Gemara we had in Maseches Tainis, of ultimately, again, every single person has a Yetzer Hara for two things, right? For gezel, for theft, and ultimately for immorality. So you begin to see again how seriously Chazal took this Yetzer Hara for immorality and the need to go ahead and legislate in such a restrictive way, even multiple generations up. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. So remember, what's fascinating about this is as follows. When it comes to reckoning the generations above my wife, so my wife ultimately, again, is included in that tally. So for example, this is called the revi'i. Why? Like we just said before, my wife is number 1, my mother-in-law is 2, my mother-in-law's mother is 3, her mother's mother, her grandmother is 4. Yet interestingly enough, when we count the generations down from my wife, we don't count the wife in that tally. So why is it that when counting the generations above her, we count her as part of the tally, but yet below we don't? To which the Gemara says, to which the Gemara is very simple, because they're all saying the generations above my wife, ultimately that Isser is an extension of my wife. In other words, why is it that my mother-in-law is Asura to me? Ultimately because she's the mother of my wife. So because that Isser stems from my relationship with my wife, therefore those generations are counted up. Lamata di Isur lav mikoach ishto kasi lo kachashivla. But in the generations below, where ultimately again the prohibition does not stem from my wife, therefore halacha lamaisa, she is not counted in the tally. I v'ha ben ishto bas ishto di Isur mikoach ishto kasi v'lo chashivla. But that's not true. The case of the wife of my wife's son, or ultimately, again, my wife's daughter. Those are isurim that, of course, stem from my wife, stem from my marriage to my wife. Yet, again, ultimately, my wife is not reckoned just in the generational tally, to which the Gemara says, I did tana shlosha doros lamata, didei v'lo chashva, tana nami gemel doros dida, sorry, let's say that again. Aidi detana shlosha doros lamata didei v'lo chashva. Since the Gemara went ahead and discussed 3 generations, ultimately again below him, and did not include the wife in that tally. Tananami gimel doros lamata dida v'lo chashva. Ultimately, again, when counting the generations below her, we don't include her as well. So essentially, it's just textual symmetry. Amrali Rav Ashi the Rav Kahana, Shnios debei Rabbi Chia, Yesh lan hefsek and hefsek. So we'll say fine. So good. So now, new case. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh b'dvaro. Okay, so it says the Gemara. Amrali Rav Ashi Rav Kahana, Shnios Rabbi Chia. When it comes to the shnios of Rabbi Chia. Right? So remember again, we alluded to on the bottom of Chaf Aleph and Beis that Allah Rabbi Chia has his own model of shnios. So in that model of shnios, which again, it only has some additional cases than the shnios that we had in the Mishnah. Or in the Bryce, I should say. Shnios Rabbi Chia. Yesh lan hefsek, oin lan hefsek. So we'll say this is a fundamental shaila, which is as follows. Halacha l'maisa. How do we look at the shnios of Rabbi Chia? Do we assume that they keep on extending out, which I will say would essentially, effectively mean that halacha l'maisa, at a certain point in time, there may be a rabbinic prohibition to marry people who are really not directly related to you, but l'maisa secondarily related to you. So do we say, but again, not every single relation, obviously it doesn't extend in every direction, but do we say that the shnios of Rabbi Chia ultimately continue on? Yesh lan hefsek or ein lan hefsek? At a certain point in time, do we stop and say ad kan shnios no longer, or no? Do we say as the generations keep going, maybe even up and down, halacha l'maisa, the shnios apply? Tashma da amarav dalid noshim yesh lan hefsek. There are 4 women who have hefsek, which I will say ultimately again there are 4 relationships where there is a cap on the shnios. There's a cap on the shnios. So the Gemara says, Visulo, and so does that indicate that it's only those 4 women and not anyone else? In other words, that in every other relationship, the shnios prohibition continues on. Dilma, to which the Gemara says, Dilma ki kamarav lahi masnisa. Maybe when Rav is talking about, he's talking about to that particular brisa. In other words, not as a general cloud to every single person, but to mention the brisa, Tashma, Shlishi, Urevi'i. So we'll say we learned before in the brisa that it said a Shlishi and Revi'i, 3rd generation, 4th generation. So what do you see from there? Shlishi Urevi'i in Tfeilo. So we'll say that seems to indicate to us that what? That even shnios have a certain point in time where they stop. Where they stop, they'll go to a 3rd generation, to a 4th generation, but ultimately, again, that is it. To which the Gemara says, Dilma mishlishi ve'elech umrevi'i ve'elech. Maybe not. Maybe what it means is that the Brisa was saying these women, even from the 3rd generation and on, even from the 4th generation and on, will still be a prohibition of shnios. Amar le Rava, the Rav Nachman, Chazi mar haimi rabbanan, the asimi mar Rava. So listen to this. Rav says, Rav Nachman, did you see the Talmid Chacham who came from Eretz Yisrael? Va'amar ba'u b'ma'arava. And he said the following. They asked in Eretz Yisrael the following shayla. Gazru shnios begerim o lo gazru shnios begerim. So we'll say, so now we're totally switching gears here for just a moment. So we'll say, so now, remember, so first of all, I will point out that halacha l'maisa, we do paskin that shnios yesh lan hefsek, right? The concept of shnios does not, right? It doesn't just keep on extending, without limit. At a certain point in time, it stops. That's what the Brisa was saying was, sometimes it'll be 3 generations, sometimes it'll be 4 generations, but for every single shniya at a certain point in time, the Isser Erva Midirabanan stops. That's how we paskin. Where it stops, who it extends to, which relationships it extends to, ultimately, again, that's subject to machlokes. The Gemara now, until the Mishnah, just transitions to a new topic. And the Gemara says something very interesting. What about Gerim? What about by converts? Is there a concept, Gazru Shnios Begerim, O lo Gazru Shnios Begerim? Both say, does the concept of shnios apply to converts or not? Now, this is a fascinating question. Look at Rashi, begerim, gazru shnios, shem haya ger nasui eim imo yotze. They both say, just to understand why this is a fascinating question. The halach is, as we're going to see, ger shniskayer kikata shnola dami. When a person converts, ultimately, again, it's as if they're reborn like a brand new person, which means that what? On halachic level, they have no relationship to their previous Gentile family, halachic relationship, I mean. Which means, just to give you the extreme case, right? We'll call him Ploni, or we'll just call him Ger, right? So Ger is born, obviously a non-Jew. He has a sister. He now converts. Is he allowed to marry his sister, his biological sister? The answer is technically yes. Why? Because from a halachic perspective, he has no relationship to her. Now, Chazal said you can't do that, right? You can't do that. Why can't you do that? Because the Gemara says, think about this in just a moment. A non-Jew is also bound by a certain code of morality, right? Shem Mitzvos B'nai Noach. Shem Mitzvos B'nai Noach tells you incest is also, you can't marry your sister. So the Gemara says, people are going to say that he went from Kiddusha Kala to Kiddusha Chemorta, that he went from a stricter standard to a lesser standard, right? When he was a guy, he wasn't allowed to marry his sister. Now he's a Jew, he's suddenly allowed to marry his sister. It doesn't make any sense. Now, listen, obviously, there's a logic to why that would be permitted, but Chazal said it doesn't look right. Leaving aside the issues of marrying your sister, talking about on a halachic sense, it doesn't look right because something that was prohibited to you as a Gentile now becomes permitted to you as a Jew. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, so let that be the background. So Rashi says, here's the example. Let's say a guy converts. And this individual is married, is married to his biological grandmother. Like I said, don't ask why, right? That's just the case. Rashi says he's married to his biological grandmother. So ultimately, again, your maternal grandmother ultimately is a shnia. So now, what's the shaila? He converted now. He was already married to her. Does he have to divorce her or not? Is there a din of shnios by gerim? So says the Gemara, here we go. So Amar, gazu shnios begerim, olo gazu shnios begerim. Amarle, hashta, Uma erva gufa ilav shelo yomru ba'in mikidusha kamura likidusha kalo gazir b'hurabanan shnios mibai. So we'll say the Gemara says something very interesting. This is what I just mentioned before. The Gemara says, at the end of the day, when it comes to erva itself is technically, in other words, if the Gentile was married to his sister, technically, when he converted, technically speaking, and let's say she converted as well, so ultimately he doesn't have to divorce her. That's a legal marriage. The only reason we say he has to divorce her is because people will say, Shelo yomru, bo'in mikidusha chamur likidusha kala. People will say, look, he's coming from a stricter moral standard when he was a Gentile to now a more relaxed moral standard, ultimately again when he's a Jew. Ultimately, again, therefore, again, l'kedusha kala. Shelo yomru kiddush ba'in mikiddush chamur l'kedusha kala lo gazu rabbanan shnios mibai. So ultimately, again, I will say that halacha l'maisa, really arayos themselves would be permitted to him, or that which was an erva when he was a guy, technically is permitted when he converts. So again, if that's only asa because of Gzeira, it doesn't seem to make sense that we would apply shnios to him as well. So the Gemara says as follows: Rav Nachman. So therefore, I will say halacha l'maisa. The Gemara seems to indicate that the concept of shnios would not apply to a ger. Again, remember, technically speaking, anyone who is related to the ger at the time that he converts, halacha l'maisa is no longer halachically related to him, which means he could marry them. Chazal said, no, you can't marry them. Essentially, whoever was an erva to you when you were a Gentile, you're not allowed to marry when you become Jewish because it doesn't look right. It looks like you're going from a stricter moral code as a Gentile to a more relaxed moral code as a Jew. But again, I both say, see over here that even what we would call technical arayos are permitted. It goes without saying, therefore, that Chazal did not legislate shnios on a ger, on a convert. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, if he was married to Aim Imo, right, if he was married to ultimately his grandmother and she converts along with him, he would not be mechuyev to go ahead and divorce her. Interesting idea. So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman, gerim, hal asla didan, nema b'hu milsa. Now that you brought up the topic of converts, let's talk about that a little bit. Achin min ha'aim, lo ya'idu. So we'll say it's an interesting case. What happens if you have maternal brothers, right? Brothers who have share the same mother but not the same father. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Achan min ha'em lo ya'idu. So maternally related brothers should not testify together. Vim he'idu, and if they went ahead and testified, edusan edos. Ultimately, again, their edos is fine. Similarly, again, the Gemara says, Achin min ha'av mi'idin l'chatchila. Paternally related brothers ultimately, again, have the right to go ahead and halacha l'maisa. Have the right to go ahead and test it. I will say, so just to be clear, this is talking about converts, right? So this is talking about two brothers who converted. So there are two different cases. One of them is where they share the same mother, but not the same father. And one of them is where they share the same father, but not the same mother. So in case number one, where they're achin min ha'em, they are maternally related brothers who convert, they ideally should not go ahead and form a testimonial unit together. Now I will say, now why is that? Now here's what's interesting. Look at Rashi. Lo ya'idu l'chatchila de korvas ein begerim korvahi dahavada imo. This is fascinating. As much as we say that when a person converts, they're kekatan shenola dami. They're like a person who was reborn, and therefore halacha l'maisa have no relationships to anyone who was a relation to theirs in their Gentile state. Ultimately, it's not true to one's mother. It's fascinating. Why? Because Rashi says over here, the relationship that one has to one's mother is the strongest relationship that exists. Why? Dehavadai imohi. Because Rabbi said, here's what's interesting is the woman who birthed you is a definitive relationship. So the Gemara over here views something very interesting, which is maternally related brothers, even when they convert, have a familial bond to one another. Therefore, lechatchila, they really should not form a testimonial unit together because they're related. They're related. Lechatchila, they shouldn't testify together. If they did testify together, then what? The Gemara says, ultimately, it works. Right? Why does it work? Because what's our fallback position? Gershinis gayer kekatan shenola dami. When a person converts, it's like he's reborn. What about paternally related brothers? So we'll say, however, again, halacha l'maisa, when you have paternally related brothers, ultimately in halacha, those brothers, when they convert, are viewed to have absolutely no relationship to each other. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, they are permitted to go ahead and form a testimonial unit together. Look at Rashi. Ma'idin lechatchila, derachmona afgarei lezera mitzri dichsiv zarmas susin zramtom hilchach korvas ad eno korvas. Essentially, halachically, for a person who converts, paternal relationship is absolutely meaningless. It's a really fascinating distinction here. Ameimar says it's not true. Even maternally related brothers, right? Even brothers who share the same mother and then convert are permitted lechatchila to go ahead and give testimony. Umayshna me arayos. So we'll say, but why is that different than arayos? Because we'll remember again, when it comes to arayos, Rashi says, "Ma'ishna edus mi'arayos ta'amar lekaman paraknosin gersha nasay chosa min emyotzi." So here's what's interesting. Ultimately, again, by arayos, we're going to be strict with a convert who is married to anyone who is related to him maternally. Yet here we're saying that when it comes to testimony, he can give testimony together with his maternal brother. So why do we make a distinction between those two? To which the Gemara is very simple. Erva la kol masura, because when it comes to arayos, everyone gets married. So because everyone gets married, we have to clamp down a little bit and be a bit stricter. However, again, Eidos lebeis din mesura. When it comes to Eidos, Rabbosai, Eidos happens in a very limited purview. It only happens in the purview of Beis Din. And therefore, ultimately, again, Rabbosai, we're not concerned that if we accept maternal brothers, ultimately, again, as witnesses, that there's going to be any further breakdown, since that is a process that is controlled by the Beis Din itself. The Gershin is Gayer, Kikatan Shinolo Dami. So I will say, essentially, what you have over here is really something incredibly amazing, which is, on one hand, we accept this concept when a person converts, ultimately, they're like a baby who's reborn. And therefore, what that means on a relationship level is what? Anyone to whom they were related to when they were a Gentile, they are what? No longer related to now in their newfound state of Jewish identity, which means pretty much you could marry anyone you want. Okay, that's the pure halacha. Comes along Chazal and says, no. Anyone who was an erva to you, when you were a Gentile, when you were a Goy, you are not permitted to now marry in your Jewish state. Why not? Because we're concerned that what it looks like is you went from a stricter moral code to a more relaxed moral code. However, what doesn't it include? Shnios. Shnios are not usher to the ger. Only what we'll call ikar erva, what will be biblical erva, ultimately is usher to the ger, but shnios are not. What about when it comes to edus? So I will say, bottom line, when it comes to edus, is halacha l'maisa, whether brothers are maternally related, convert brothers are maternally related or paternally related, halacha l'maisa, they are permitted to go ahead and give testimony together, even lechatchila. Why? Because since testimony is a very limited halachic framework and it's given over to the purview of Beis Din, therefore again we go with the basic principle of gershnis gayer kekatan shenola dami. When a person converts, it's as if they are reborn, and therefore their testimony is accepted. Beautiful. We'll just point out to you something quite beautiful. The Be'er Shlomo, the Sefer Be'er Shlomo, he quotes over here from the concept that if you notice, and this is all over Shas, Whenever we speak about a convert, we always speak about what? A ger shenis gayer. And the Be'er Shlomo says something amazing. He says, that's not the right verbiage, right? How should it read? How should it really read? Goy shenis gayer, right? It's not a convert who converts, it's a Gentile, right? It's a guy who converts. What do you mean, ger shenis gayer? So I will say, so this is absolutely beautiful. He said, listen to these words. Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchev has the same concept in his section on Shavuos on Megillas Rus. He says, Kizos lifnim mima'amad har Sinai, shekibalnu haTorah sham nimtza nefesh hager hazeh, haba achar zman rav ma'od lihisgayer. So I will say, because why? When a person converts, it's not just the pshat that it's a happenstance thing. That neshama of the person who converted stood at Har Sinai with us. That nefesh stood at Har Sinai. Kimosh kasav Chazal, the nefashos hagerim amdu b'maimad Har Sinai. The neshamas of all future gerim stood at Har Sinai, said Na'as seven nishma together with Klal Yisrael. Plus Rabbi Yitzchak expounds on this very quickly. Rabbi Yitzchak expounds on this a little bit. He quotes the Zohar. The Zohar says that Akash Baruch Hu offered up the Torah to every single nation. Right? We know it's a Gemara. Offered up the Torah to every nation. And what happened? Every nation said, okay, what's in it? What's in it, right? So Yishmael, so Edom, Edom says, what's in it? And Akash Baruch Hu says, Lo sirzach, you can't kill. Edom says, no, thank you. We like to kill, so sorry, we're not going to be able to take it. It goes to Yishmael. What is Yishmael? What does it say? Lo sinaf, you have to be moral. Yishmael says, we like immorality. We like immorality. Everybody passes on it. Comes to Klal Yisrael, so say, but listen to this. So the Zohar says, but the umos, all the nations of the world, felt guilty for not accepting the Torah. So what did they do? They pledged neshamas. They said, as a nation, we're not going to accept the Torah. But we pledge a certain number of people from amongst our ranks who are going to join Klal Yisrael in future generations. Gerim are those pledged neshamas. They are those pledged souls who were pledged at Maimad Har Sinai, who were pledged at Mount Sinai Har Sinai, and joined Klal Yisrael throughout the generations. This is how Rabbi Yitzchak Berditchev explains Rus. He says the story of Rus is totally illogical. Why would a Moabite princess give up everything in order to join the Jewish people? To which the Rebbe says, essentially, her neshama was predestined. Her neshama was pledged already from Har Sinai. And that's what the Be'er Shlomo was saying over here. That's what I will say, it's incredible. That's a Chazal. And Chazal allude to this. That's a Chazal never used the formulation of Goy shenis gayer. It's not a Goy, because Goy shenis gayer sounds like, again, you're a Gentile. It's always ger shenis gayer. That when a person converts, what they're doing is they're actualizing something in their neshama that was already there. It was already there. It was already, so to speak, pre-programmed in the spiritual DNA of that neshama that they are going to join the ranks of Klal Yisrael. Ger shenis gayer. Incredible. But let's say Mishnah. So that, by the way, that brings to an end Shnios a little bit. And let's go. So we'll say, now this is very exciting because now we're getting back a little bit to the mechanics. I know everyone loves the Shnios family trees, but we're going to go back a little bit to the mechanics now of Yibum, which is really fascinating. We'll say, whoever has a brother. Now, interesting, the Lashon over is an ach mikol makom. We'll say, what's an ach mikol makom? Any kind of brother. Any kind of brother, right? Any kind of surviving brother ultimately, again, obligates the widow in Yibum. Again, we'll discuss exactly what the Gemara is trying to highlight, what the Mishnah is trying to highlight. Ve'echav hu l'chol davar. And ultimately, again, any kind of brother is still my brother for all things. We'll discuss chutz mimi sheyesh la'ach min hashivcha u'min avedas kochavim. Except we'll say if my father fathered a son with a shivcha or an avedas kochavim, in that case, that boy is not my brother, right? Because since he does not have a Jewish mother, therefore halacha l'maaseh he's not my brother. So even though we are related paternally, he's not my brother. Right? The brother. So we'll say, I just want to point out this interesting idea. Yibum only applies to paternal brothers, but the concept of halachic brotherhood only applies to someone who is maternally, who's born to a Jewish mother. Right? If he's not born to a Jewish mother, halacha l'maisa, he's not Jewish. If he's not Jewish, he's not my brother. Once he has a Jewish mother, then we could build on other levels. So for Yibum, having a Jewish mother is not enough. We have to be related paternally as well. Anyone who has a son, and any kind of son. So we'll say, if a man has a son, and we'll see what that means, any kind of son, this will exempt his widow from Yibum. Remember, Rabbi say Yibum only applies if a man dies without children. Right? So halacha l'maisa, if a man has a son, any kind of son, halacha l'maisa, his widow is ptura from Yibum. V'chayiv al makasav al kilalaso, and ultimately, again, a son is chayiv. If he hits his father, if he curses his father, ubeno l'chol davar. And this son, again, we'll discuss what kind of son we're talking about. Is my son, is his son for all matters. Chutz, we just said before, except if a man fathers a child with a shivcha, a maidservant, or ultimately again a non-Jewish woman, that is not halachically his son because that child is not Jewish. Good. So we'll say, let's analyze this. We'll say, how did the Mishnah start? The Mishnah started that ultimately, again, if a man has any kind of brother, right? Any kind of brother, halacha l'maisa, again, that obligates the wife in Yibum. So what does that mean? So I'm Rabbi Yehuda Lasri Mamzer. And we'll say, what does it come to include? If my brother is a Mamzer. Let's say a man has a brother who's a Mamzer. And we'll say, so again, very simple case. Father, two boys, Reuven and Shimon, right? Reuven was conceived, we'll call it in regular marriage. Shimon was the result of adultery. Okay, so Reuven and Shimon share the same father, but again, Shimon is a mamzer. So halacha l'maisa, what the Mishnah is teaching me is as follows: even though Shimon is a mamzer, halacha l'maisa, Shimon is still Reuven's brother. Even though he's a mamzer, he's still Reuven's brother, and therefore halacha l'maisa, should Reuven die without children, Shimon would obligate the widow in Yibum, or Shimon would be obligated in Yibum. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. Achivu, or as we'll say, it's his brother. Why would you think that Shimon the mamzer is not Reuven's brother, right? Why would you think otherwise? I'll tell you why. I might have thought, I'll say this takes us back to the beginning of Yevamos. I might have thought that what? They make a gzera shava of ach va'ach, right? This is what we'll say. It says lashon of brother by Yibum. It says lashon of brother when it counts the sons of Yaakov Avinu. Ma lahalon ksherin, just like by the sons of Yaakov, they were all genealogically fit. V'lo psulin. Avkan ksher v'lo psulin. I might have thought of achva from Yibum to Bnei Yaakov. Just like Bnei Yaakov, they're all genealogically fit. So too, again, by Yibum, they're all genealogically fit. That maybe the only type of brother who is obligated in Yibum is a brother who is genealogically fit. But if Shimon is a mamzer, as much as he is the surviving brother and a paternal brother of Reuven, perhaps there's no din of Yibum. Kamashwa, no. That's what the Mishnah is coming to teach me. A brother is a brother is a brother. I will say, by the way, what an incredible yisod also in Achdus as well. Right? So I will say, even if someone's a mamzer, he's still your brother. He's still your brother, I will say, right? In other words, it's easy to feel a sense of relation to those who are just like you. But the whole chap of Achdus, the whole chap of being a mishpacha achos, being one family, being a klal, is that even though sometimes the people who we are related to behave like mamzerim, act like mamzerim, may even be mamzerim, they're still my brothers. Still my brothers. Such an incredible yisod. They are achinami. Tushim said, well, why not? Why do we make a gzera shav of achva from Yibum to Bnei Yosef and say that halacha l'maisa, maybe if a brother's a mamzer, there is no din of Yibum. Kevan de le'inyan Yibum niftar. Oh, look at Rashi. Inyan Yibum miftar. Rashi says this Eishes aviv miyubum. So I'll say, I'll tell you why. Since everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, let's say again, let's go back. Reuven, I'm sorry, I keep switching the names. Reuven has a son who is a mamzer, right? Reuven is married to Rachel, and he has an extramarital affair with Leah, who's married to someone else, and they have a mamzer. Now Reuven passes away. As we're going to prove for a moment, and halacha l'maisa in a moment, that halacha l'maisa, the existence of that son ultimately frees Rachel from Yibum. Right, ultimately, so we see from here that having a son who is a mamzer exempts the now deceased brother, or exempts the widow from Yibum. Kevan de inyan Yibum miftar niftar, since ultimately again the existence, when a man dies he leaves behind a mamzer son, it ultimately exempts the widow from Yibum. Therefore Amud Beis, miskak nami zakak. Ultimately again, therefore the existence of a mamzer brother will obligate the widow in Yibum. So therefore I will say, that is what the Mishnah is coming to include. That halacha l'maisa, when the Mishnah says an ach mikol makom, any kind of brother is obligated in Yibum, it means even if the surviving brother is a mamzer. So we'll say, so now again, this gets into yesterday's discussion, which is quite fascinating, which is what? But one second, a mamzer is not allowed to marry who? Not allowed to marry who? Right, he's not allowed to marry a regular Jewish woman. So I will say, so I'm just going to point, so how that works, right? So again, essentially what's going to end up happening in a case where the surviving brother is a mamzer is what? What are you going to have to do? Chalitza, right? But the point over here is that there is an obligation of Yibum / Chalitza, even if the only surviving brother is a mamzer. Incredible. And ultimately, again, even if my brother is a mamzer, he is my brother for all matters. So we'll say, what does that come to include? Liyarsho, it means again to inherit me. Let's say again, all I have is one mamzer brother, and he is my closest relative. He's going to inherit me when I die. Ulatamelo, and we'll say halacha l'maisa. If ultimately, well, the Yarsho could also mean I would inherit him. And I will say, you know what else this means? Let's say we're a family of Kohanim, and I have a mamzer brother. My mamzer brother dies. Ultimately, again, I am permitted to go to his levaya. Right? Brother is one of the relatives whom you're permitted, a kohen is permitted to become tamei, even though he is a mamzer. Right? Halacha l'maisa, I am permitted to become tamei for him. So Gemara says, pshita. I don't understand. Isn't that obvious? Achivhu. So I will say, a brother is a brother, right? In other words, at the end of the day, the fact that he's genealogically tarnished, because ultimately he's the result of an illicit union, how does that change the mitzias that we come from the same father, and both of us have Jewish mothers, right? Because remember, again, you have to have a Jewish mother, right? So at the end, he's my brother, so why would I think that he wouldn't be my brother? In other words, why would I think that halachically he wouldn't be? So I'll tell you why. Because listen to this. When the Torah speaks about the license for a Kohen to go ahead and become tamei for close relatives, the Torah uses the lashon of l'she'iro hakarov elav. So the Gemara says she'iro zu ishto. Ultimately, again, she'iro, she'er refers to one's wife. Kohen is permitted to become tamei for his wife. Uksiv lo yitama bal ba'amav laheichalo. Yet the pasuk says that ultimately, again, a husband Kohen should not become tamei and profane himself. So which one is it? So is a Kohen permitted to become tamei for his wife, not permitted to become tamei for his wife? It depends. There are times where a husband can become tamei, and times where a husband can't become tamei. When? So the Gemara says, "Haketzad nitma'u nitmetamehu leishto kshera ve'metame leishto psula." Here you go, both say. Listen to this. By a Kohen, what's the halacha? Could a Kohen go to the levaya of his wife? And what's the answer? It depends. What does it depend on? Is it a legal marriage? If it's a legal marriage, he could become tamei for his wife. If it's not a legal marriage, he may not become tamei for his wife. You might have thought that maybe the same halacha applies over here. Maybe a Kohen could only become tamei for his brother, who is genealogically fit, who's kosher. But for his brother, who's a mamzer, perhaps he can't become tamei. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash Malon said that halacha l'maisa, we don't make that distinction. That interesting, although we make the distinction by marriage, that isn't the. So say, for example, if a Kohen married a divorcee, that is in a legal marriage. It works. In other words, kiddushin is tovsin. It works, but it's in a legal marriage. And then that wife dies. Halacha l'maisa, a Kohen cannot become tamei for that wife. So why? So the Gemara says, but that only applies by marriage. It doesn't ultimately, again, apply to your brother. But one second, why doesn't it apply to the brother? Why don't you say the same way that a Kohen can only become tamei for a wife who is fit, so to speak, so too can only become tamei for a brother who is fit as well? Rabbi says it's actually pretty profound. Hasam la fuke kaima, hacha achifu. Rabbi says a fundamental distinction, which is you can choose your spouse. You can't choose your family. In other words, they both say who you are related to as your brother is a de facto state. Who you marry is an active choice. So it is incredibly profound. So therefore, again, my brother is my brother as a result of circumstances that are not of my choosing, right? I didn't choose for my father to go ahead and do this. So because siblings are a de facto state, therefore we don't look at the genealogical fitness or unfitness of the brother when deciding what he's my brother, as opposed to marriage, where ultimately I choose my spouse. Again, if it's illegal, there are repercussions. If it's legal, there aren't repercussions. That's the distinction. Therefore, both say, halach l'maisva comes out as follows. Therefore, what the Mishnah is teaching me is that if the surviving brother is a mamzer, ultimately, again, there is still a chi of yibum. Still a chi of yibum. Now again, we know he can't actually do yibum. It's going to end up being chalitza. But lamaisa, again, there is a din of yibum. Why? Because my mamzer brother is my brother for all matters. Which means, again, I inherit him if he passes away. If I'm a Kohen and he dies, I'm permitted to go and be metame for him. That's the halacha. Good. The exception to this rule is if my father had a son with a non-Jewish woman, then that man is not my brother. Is not my brother. My taima, because by a shivcha, the Torah says that when a Jewish man fathers a child with a shivcha, with a maidservant, ultimately, again, the woman, the shivcha, and her offspring belong to the master. The idea Torah is teaching us that Allah Lamaisa, children that one fathers with a non-Jewish woman do not have the status of Jewish children. And therefore, again, by definition, it's not my brother. So ultimately, remember, if let's say we'll call Reuven and Shimon, right? And now Reuven passed away, and he left behind a son who is a mamzer, right? So in other words, Reuven was married to Rachel, but he had an extramarital affair with a married woman, produced a mamzer. So now the fact that when he dies, he is considered to have a son, and therefore again, Rachel, his widow, is not subject to yibum, because a mamzer son is still a son. To which the Gemara says, Mikol makom la'asuyemai. So we'll say when it tells us that a mamzer son is a son for all matters, what does that come to include? Rabbi Yehuda la'asuye mamzer. So the Gemara says la'asuye mamzer. So my time, Adamar Kra uben ein lo ayin alav. So we'll say it's interesting in the pasuk by Yibum it says uben ein lo. Now ein could have been written without a yud, just aleph nun. It's written in the longer form with a yud. Ein aleph yud nun could also be vocalized as ayin, which would normally be written with an I, which means investigate, meaning that if there is any form of son that this man has left behind, there is no din of yibum, which means even if it's a compromised son. What's an example of a compromised son? A mamzer. So even if Reuven, the now deceased brother, leaves behind the mamzer, ultimately, again, he is the existence of the mamzer exempts the widow from yibum. So I'll say ultimately, again, listen to this. So if a mamzer strikes his father, right? A mamzer's son hits his father, he's chayiv for hitting his father, right? I'll say one is chayiv misa for hitting their father, for cursing their father. See, even a mamzer's son is chayiv. Listen to this, this is incredible. I don't stand. Amai karikan v'nasi ba'amcha losar ba'osa ma'isa amcha. Rabbi say the Torah says v'nasi, and a prince, right? A prince, a leader of your people, you shall not curse. Then Rabbi say the Gemara darshans ba'ose ma'ase amcha. In general, when is there a chiyuv to avoid disrespect? Only when a person lives a proper life. If someone ultimately again flaunts proper normative conduct, then halacha l'maisa, the obligation to respect them and to revere them is not intact. So we'll say, now watch this. If we'll call, right, if mamzer, right, if there's a mamzer, that means that what? What does that say about his father? Not a good guy. Right? If he's not a good guy, then l'maisa again, why does the mamzer have the chiyuv of honoring and respecting him? And therefore, by extension, if the mamzer hits his father or curses his father, why should there be a chiyuv? To which the Gemara says, ultimately, what's the case? The father did tshuva. To which the Gemara says, but can you do tshuva after you produce the mamzer? What's the case when the Pushalal says in Koheles, something that is crooked cannot be made straight? Ultimately, what's an example of something you can't do tshuva for? an illicit relationship that produces a mamzer. You can't walk that back, right? That's it. To which the Gemara says, Hashta miha osema samcha. Says, we'll have to stop over. We'll pick up with this in Meretz Hashem tomorrow. But the Gemara is going to make a very interesting distinction, which is that sometimes halacha l'maisa, as much as you can't undo the repercussions of your act, the ability to do personalistic tshuva could still be in effect. In other words, I could have produced a result that I cannot walk back. That's the mamzer case. But that doesn't change my personalistic ability to change. We'll pick up with that last piece tomorrow, and the Meretz should figure that sugi. Tomorrow we'll say, shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, Moshe Ben Sion. Everyone have a great day, everyone. David, Cherry, have a great day, everyone.